So it's been a little while since I've had an opportunity to do one of these. On a good note, I've actually gotten a different job. I start tomorrow morning. I don't know how it's going to work out, but the hours look like they're going to actually be decent for a change, or at least some semblance of normalcy. So I'll probably have an opportunity to do, these more regularly, or so I hope. And the last time I had done any of these, I was, dissecting and tearing apart the We Agnostics chapter, and just not in the mood to do that tonight for some reason. As a matter of fact, I actually had an idea to talk about 1984 Orwell and AA. I know I had promised before in the past I was gonna do kind of an analysis on that, and I'm not exactly sure if I'll be able to cover it all in one video or not. But the thing I wanted to focus on was actually not so much a political analysis of Orwell's work, but more the manipulation of reality, the contradictory lies that one was supposed to pragmatically accept, the concept of doublethink, and a few other, key components in that. I remember when I first started to reject AA, or at least I began to question the dogma that I was hearing all the time. I remember one of the first things that I think that used to puzzle and bother me more than anything else was the way it contradicted itself all the time, and the way that the members could seemingly say two contradictory things in the same exact share without even noticing that they had made an inconsistent statement. And a lot of the times it was excused as being a paradox. And I've talked about paradoxes and contradictions before on here, but to reiterate, a paradox looks like a contradiction at first until you examine it a little bit more closely, and you see it's not contradictory at all. For example, the best one I always use when I'm trying to give an example of a paradox is if I said I wasted my youth by being young. And first glance, it looks like a really contradictory statement. I wasted my youth by being young, but upon closer examination, it's not contradictory at all, because when I was young, I was immature. I made foolish decisions. I didn't see the big picture of things, etc. So you could say I wasted my youth by being young. In AA, when you give a completely contradictory statement, for instance, when you say that one is powerless over alcohol, that their life is unmanageable, that they cannot stop drinking on their own without a higher power dictating it, but then they turn around and they tell you that you chose to pick up a bottle of drink, is a completely contradictory statement, where both statements cannot possibly be true. The same thing with when they'll tell you don't make any major decisions for a year in the meetings, but then they'll turn around and they'll say something like you have to change people, places, things, and everything else about you. And I remember on numerous occasions, the thought would run through my mind that Orwell would have had a field day with AA. Or, I even think I said that to somebody one time. I had to check something there. And it was funny at the time I said it, the person didn't know who Orwell was. And it's interesting to me. I was almost hesitant to bring up 1984 because it's thrown around quite a lot. It has been for the past, for a long time. I mean, anytime there's any kind of thing about, government surveillance or loss of privacy or or censorship or anything along that line in the news media, eventually, somewhere along the way, someone's going to say Big Brother, they're going to say Orwell, or they're going to say 1984 or something like that. So there's been times I've almost wanted to say that it's been overused to the point it's meaningless. But the book itself had a very profound effect on me when I first read it. I read it when I was 16 years old. And it wasn't like an assigned reading in school or something like that. It was something I discovered in the school libraries. And I remember at the time, the thing that terrified me the most, outside of the loss of privacy and the loss of being able to have freedom of thought, was the manipulation of information. where you couldn't look anything up, where you couldn't verify anything, where you were constantly fed lies on a daily basis that was always being reprinted, recensored, and redone, to the point the main protagonist of the book himself is always questioning his own reality. He's not sure if what he's remembering is real or not. For instance, in one key scene, he remembers that the government is at war with Eurasia and has always been at war with Eurasia, but he can almost swear that the government was at war with East Asia only a little while ago in the span of a few years, but he can't be confidently sure of that because there's certainly no way to go look up information that's being constantly censored and reprinted, and there's certainly no way to ask somebody something like that. For to ask somebody something like that could land you in a gulag. But it was the manipulation of the way people think and the manipulation of lies to the point that you could turn them into truths that really fascinated me back then. And it wasn't really so much in a political sense that it worried me, because I remember at the time, I mean, it was really a profound book for me, because I remember thinking about how much of the information that we process is what we're told to think, or how much of what we, and I'm saying we in a general basis, I'm not talking about, I'm not making a sweeping statement, but I guess for myself it was, there were so many things in my life that I had accepted as being concrete or absolute that I had never really thought about in any kind of way other than, that particular set of ideals, that it couldn't be questioned, that it was set in stone. Part of that coming from a heavily religious background like I did. And it was kind of around that time that particular book got me to thinking about the fact that when you have a certain amount of peers who believe a certain way, and when you got a certain, when you got where you live, the people you're around think a certain way, how much of what you actually are thinking and believing is your own freedom of thought. And I didn't really do anything with that at the time, but it was something that I guess was almost like a lifelong curiosity for me. It was something that I never fully forgot, even though, I don't think anybody's above being manipulated or influenced by their peers and the people around them. I mean, I've questioned that before in my life. I mean, obviously, I wasn't above it because, I fell hook, line, and sinker for AA, even after reading a book like that and thinking about those kinds of things. And I think that is something I want to throw out there before I go any further, is that a lot of people who get sucked into these cult situations, I see them on Facebook and, online and stuff like that, they have a tendency to beat themselves up as being, I must have been really stupid to have fallen, for this type of manipulation or this type of brainwashing. And I think it's almost in the public conscience that if you fall for something like a cult or something like that, that, you can't have been that bright, or that you're weak, or that, there's something bad wrong with you mentally for you to be susceptible to that. Failing to see that manipulation of information and things like that happens to people all the time is not maybe in a cult setting, but it's more common and probably more prevalent than people realize. But anyway, I guess if I was going to start an analysis of 1984, I'd want to start kind of at the beginning. I really don't want to get into the politics and the history of it, but it's going to be kind of hard to talk about it without doing that. And as far as any parallels between what's going on in the world today in 1984, I'm going to leave that alone and let you draw your own conclusions. I do think it's funny how both sides of the fence, whether you're right or left wing or whatever party affiliation you might choose to identify with, is always accusing the other side of behaving like, 1984. I have ideas and opinions on politics, but I'm not as well informed as many, and so therefore I stay completely out of them. Plus, that's not the purpose of what we're doing here on this channel. As someone like me who's pretty much anti-authoritarian and pretty much anti-belonging to everything and who's very pro-individualism, I believe that people should be allowed to make their own decisions and come to their own political conclusions or religious conclusions. You don't need me to tell you how to do that. I'm just up here to destroy AA and its bullshit. But 1984 begins, of course, in kind of an alternate universe than our history. Uh, and at the time Orwell wrote that, and I can say that Orwell was always questioning his own ideas and things, and he was always rejecting certain things throughout his life. There was a lot of things about Orwell I would not have liked as a person. I don't think if we had ever met or anything in certain points of his life, we would have got along at all politically or a lot of other things. And I'm not talking about his political affiliations. I'm talking about some of his own. I'd have to go. That's a whole nother lecture. I won't go into all of that. It's Chris Hitchens' book, Why Orwell Matters, brings up a lot of it. The kindest thing you could say about Orwell was he was always questioning any ideal he held or anything like that, and he was always rejecting things that he once held dear. At the time that he wrote 1984, he was upset at the fact that the free world, that Britain and the United States and the rest of the free world had allied up with Stalin in order to defeat Hitler. He saw Stalin as being just as bad as Hitler, and to make a treaty with Stalin to him was almost like making a deal with the devil. At the time, he was kind of the mindset that Hitler could have been defeated without the help of the Soviets. I don't know if he ever rejected that later on in life or not, but he just, that didn't sit well with him at all. And plus, he was loyal to Russian leader Trotsky at one point in his life. And, Stalin had Trotsky killed. And in fact, there's a parallel in 1984 about that. But he was loyal to Communist Revolutionary Trotsky at one point in his life. As a matter of fact, it's funny, when Stalin took power, that was one of Stalin's trumped up charges he would bring on people and have them arrested. The guy had Trotskyist literature. The guy was secretly a Trotskyist. Trotsky was one of the big bad boogeyman of communism under Stalin. If you were a bad person, if you were a person he wanted to get rid of, he could always add, you were a Trotskyist to the list. I think that Orwell had this ideal that if Trotsky had got the Soviet Union after Lenin, that it would have been a different world than the nightmare world Stalin created. But at the time that World War II ended, in China, you had the communist revolution going on, and China didn't look too good in terms of what the emerging superpowers would be. So he was seeing a world that was going to be subdivided with the Soviet Union and China and the free world, and he was kind of predicting that if things didn't change in the course of history, that the free world would be gone. Which is exactly what happens at the beginning of 1984. In the beginning of 1984, the world is divided, and the parallel is he even admitted, I think, later on in life that his history or that his prediction was not true, because the United States and England and Ireland and parts of, I can't remember the exact geography. I don't think that's really important, but it's become a totalitarian dictatorship called Oceania. And what's the Soviet Union, you could say, and Europe and all of that is absorbed into Eurasia. It's a totalitarian superpower. China, Japan, and the rest of Asia is absorbed into a place that calls itself East Asia. And they're all in perpetual war over a certain stretch of territories, like in the Third World, and they're in a perpetual state of war that they can never possibly hope to win, because all three superpowers cannot possibly do anything if they defeat the other superpowers. And information is limited as to what goes on in these three superpowers, but you can tell there's a parallel between the Soviet Union and Communist China and what he was afraid the rest of the free world was going to become. But the tale focuses on the protagonist, Winston Smith, and he's not your hero in your I wanted to look at something that I'd written down there. Well, never mind. He's not a hero in your usual sense. He's just a citizen of the state of Oceania in a place called Airstrip 1, which was normally England, before all of this took place, which in Orwell's fictional universe, there has been, a series of world wars. There's been a series of revolutions. There's been more world wars. There's been nuclear wars, etc. And Winston Smith works for the press. and his job is to publish, stuff for the press. And here's an interesting thing about the contradiction. The first contradiction I remember reading when I started with the book is you have four main offices that control the citizenship of England. Well, Airstrip 1 as it's called now. You have the Ministry of Truth, which prints out lies. You have the Ministry of Plenty, which is concerned with starvation of the population. You have the Ministry of Love, which concerns itself with fear, terror, and intimidation. And you have the Ministry of Peace, which concerns itself with war. Everything's a contradiction here, kind of like AA. In fact, the party slogans war is peace, ignorance is strength, freedom is slavery sounds very contradictory. But under this current regime, or this futuristic regime, this nightmare world that Orwell created, those statements are supposed to be 100% true. And that war is peace, that freedom is slavery, and that ignorance is strength. Now, if you were to say that on the streets in our modern world, everybody would say you were nuts. In the fictional world of 1984, to say something wrong with these party slogans, something the matter with these government offices, they seem to be in total contradiction of what they stand for. That would be a good way to end up in a gulag, or the equivalent of a gulag. The party principle that concerns itself the most, the control that it exerts over the population, is called doublethink, and people use a new form of language called newspeak. Doublethink is supposedly the ability to hold two contradictory ideas at the same time and declare them both true. But the party, the ruling power of Oceania, is not content with just you saying, okay, both those statements are true. I'm on board with that. They're not. That's definitely not okay with them. I mean, you're supposed to not only accept that they're true, you're supposed to believe they're true. You're supposed to love the fact that they're true. You're not supposed to harbor any doubts. You're not supposed to harbor any ill feelings, because you are bordering on what is called thought crime. Thought crime would be to have doubts, or thought crime would be to have, well, it would be even mortally dangerous to ask a question, or it would be even more dangerous, to voice aloud a concern. It's a good way to disappear. And some of the characteristics of a cult that I was looking up and reading about, and I'll let you kind of draw your own opinion with cult characteristics, is you have absolute authority in a cult, total control over the information that you're given. Any type of thinking outside of the box, or any kind of questioning of the authority of the cult, is considered almost a sacrilege or a crime. Cults are very much an all-inclusive bunch that pretend to love you, but in fact that they really totally hate you if you exert any kind of independent thought or independent exertion of will. Normally, a lot of cults, in AA's case, the most they can do is shun you, but they browbeat into your head all day long. All the time, I should say, or not all day long, all the time is what I meant to say. The idea that if you leave them, it's jails, institutions, and death. That if you leave them, you're doomed to pick up a bottle again. You're doomed to drink yourself to death. You're doomed to death if you walk out the door. And the whole entire time you're in AA, this is the parallels I want to draw, at least in this first video. I may do more on this. Is the idea that of thought crime. Okay, if you got a resentment against AA, there's something bad wrong with you. You've done something wrong. You haven't worked the program correctly. You're not following the rules. And they don't throw you in gulags in AA, of course. No, they just tell you that you're headed for a relapse and you're headed for drunken death. And you have a self-fulfilling kind of prophecy that I've noticed in AA, because I've seen so many people that, for instance, if they go out and they have themselves a beer, or they have themselves a glass of wine or something like that, the induced feelings of shame, the induced feelings of guilt, the induced feelings of being far worse of a person than you already are, the idea that you have shamed the AA organization and let people down is very strong and is very present. I saw it a lot in my time there. I felt it. I remember the first time Sorry, I got a bit of a sinus problem going on here. It's that time of year, you know. I remember the first time that I drank after being in AA for an extended period. I remember the feeling. I think it was this terrible feeling, like I'd done an awful thing. I'd committed a hideous crime, and there is a layout in 1984 for thought criminals. Thought criminals, in certain cases, to rip off one particular scene, this guy is arrested for talking in his sleep. And in his sleep, he was saying "down with Big Brother," and one of his own children turned him in to the police, the thought police. And he's sitting in his cell at one point, and he's saying, "I hope they don't shoot me, for what I've done. But, I think the party is a very fair and just organization. It has to be. I trust them for that. But, thought crime is it's just a terrible, horrible, frightening thing. It could get into your brain without you even knowing about it. Not too long ago, I thought I might have had a bad thought about Big Brother and the government, and now I'm saying bad things about it in my sleep. I'm glad they got me. I'm glad they got me before the thing could get too out of hand and too out of control. And of course, the penalty for thought crime in 1984 is a little bit different than your traditional dictatorships, and that's a kind of a parallel to AA I was drawing with this one. Is that in traditionally, or even in present day, totalitarian societies, people who go against the government, who, print subversive material, revolutionary types, they're usually executed, or they're sent to labor camps, or they're, tortured and murdered. But in the future, this far future dystopian world that I'm outlining, that was in 1984, the party was also concerned about what you thought and what you might think and what you might dream or what you might feel. It wasn't enough in their eyes that you obey them. You have to accept them, love them, trust them, and give yourself wholeheartedly to them. In fact, that's the driving force in Orwell's futuristic society of iron totalitarianism that separates it from the groups today. The group, the ruling powers of the past and the ruling powers, before, I guess if you were thinking subversive thoughts about them, they weren't too concerned about it until you acted on it. I mean, if you started picking up revolutionary pamphlets and you started talking to people that were against the government on the street, well, then you had a real problem with them. But the parties, the various parties in history, their primary purpose, if they caught you in such an act, was probably to get rid of you, to stamp you out. The party of the dystopian future of 1984 wants to literally change your thought processes to where you will worship the party, and to where you will beg to be executed while your mind is still clean, in case you could have another thought crime. Now, of course, AA people are going to say I'm giving a really extreme example here, but I don't think, unless you've ever actually been trapped within the rooms or the walls or anything, how anybody can understand how terrified they keep you at the possibility of a relapse, or the possibility of drinking again, of how there's this feeling when you do pick up a bottle, or when you do relapse on whatever it is you're doing, there's this feeling that you've done a horrible thing, that you've done an evil thing, and that you're doomed to death. You're doomed to alcoholic death as a result of it. I wonder, looking back on the strict religious upbringing I had, it took me years to get away from all of that, which had a lot of guilt, a lot of induced guilt, a lot of feelings of unworthiness and things of that nature. I wonder if some of that psychological vestiges that were left over is part of what made the brainwashing so hard for me in AA. But the actual parallels between the idea that, when it comes to cult religion is constantly trying to get into your thoughts. You're always constantly monitoring yourself. You're always constantly examining everything you do in every situation. And the only thing you're primarily concerned with being is a good cult member, that's conforming to the organization. The organization says they're more important than your wife, your family, your job, or anything else. You know, just doing what they say to do and following their instructions and their rules is the only thing that's required in life to get ahead or do anything, you know, without avoiding alcoholic death, more or less. They don't punish you, you know, by government authoritarian power, but they punish you mentally. And when you're surrounded by everybody, the way they kind of isolate you from the rest of society, you know, a lot of people when it comes to religious cults, you know, they see this idea that, you know, you're on some compound out there in the West somewhere in the middle of the desert, you know, and you're cut off from all society, or you're trapped in some situation like Jim Jones or something like that, and they say that, you know, AA can't possibly be even closely paralleled or aligned to that because, you know, you're pretty much free to move about in society when you're in AA, but that's not 100% really true if you're in AA for any period of time. You surround yourself, your peers, the people you rely on, your sponsors, the people you trust, the people you talk to. Slowly but surely, the influences in regular, everyday, ordinary people become less and less, and before you know it, and you turn around, the only people you're talking to, the only people you're communicating with, the only people you're hanging out with is AA people and sponsors and hanging out in meetings. I think that's one of the reasons they stress the fact that you have to sit in meetings for the rest of your life, or they trick you by saying, you know, one day at a time you sit in meetings for the rest of your life. But what happens when you sit in meetings and meet with sponsors and do service work and all that all the days of your life? Slowly but surely, the rest of the social fabric that you have outside of that erodes and eventually goes away completely. I remember at the time I left AA, there was not a single person that I could turn around and talk to that didn't seem to be full of AA dogma. Or, you know, outside of that, and toxic family members that were just saying, you need to quit drinking, you need to quit drinking, you know, and all that other hateful bullshit that was being shoved down my throat. You know, it made me identify, I guess, a little bit more strongly with an individual like Winston Smith in 1984, who's living in a world where he can't trust his own senses anymore because he has no way of relying on any information from anybody that doesn't mirror what the party does to you in the fictional dystopian future. You have no way of having a rational conversation with anybody. You have no way of turning to anybody that might, you know, say, yeah, I agree with you. This is, you know, crazy what they're doing to me. It erodes your mind. It erodes your sanity, and it's a hell of a thing to try to come out from underneath when you've been stuck in it for too long. Anyway, I didn't put my contact lenses in before I started this. I'm at 28 minutes. I was kind of just warming up to this, but I'm going on too long with it. I think I may do another little bit more of an in-depth analysis with the characters in the book and everything like that, but I'm not 100% sure if I will. I mean, part of, like I said, what I feel is relevant about 1984 in AA is about the manipulation of information, the lies. It's not really so much about the political analysis. But I could, you know, who knows? I mean, I did this video totally on the spur of the moment. I had no pre-planning. Who knows? Maybe I can look over some notes and get some more ideas or something like that and put together a better presentation next time, eh? Until then,